Hola, benvinguts de part de les biblioteques de Barcelona a aquesta xerrada que farem ara amb la Brit Bennett. La Brit ja la tenim aquí. Hi, Brit, welcome.
Hi. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. És possible que encara no conegueu la Brit perquè aquesta novel·la de la qual avui parlarem, que és la seva segona novel·la, és la primera que es publica d'ella a casa nostra, tot i que després de l'èxit que ha tingut aquesta estic convençuda que també recuperarem l'anterior, que es deia The Mothers. Avui, però, estem aquí per parlar de La meitat evanescent, un llibre que publiquen Periscopi i Literatura Random House, que també us donen la benvinguda aquesta conversa i que també l'estan fent possible. Llavors, és un llibre que jo crec que és millor no explicar moltes coses, perquè és d'aquells que comences i vols saber, vols saber, vols saber. Llavors, amb la Brit ja dèiem que intentarem no fer-vos cap spoiler, però sí que d'entrada m'agradaria situar una mica la història perquè sapigueu de què va. La història passa durant 20 anys, comença l'any 68 i va fins l'any 88 i comencem a Louisiana amb unes germanes que són bessones idèntiques que creixen a un poble que es diu Mallard, que té la peculiaritat que els negres d'aquest poble són molt blancs, tenen la pell absolutament clara. Elles dues no són gaire felices en aquest poble, viuen només amb la seva mare i un dia decideixen escapar-se. I la novel·la el que fa és començar quan una d'elles torna al poble. Llavors anireu descobrint mentre llegiu, això sí que es pot explicar, que cada una d'elles pren un camí diferent i una fa un camí com a negra i l'altra fa un camí com a blanca, que és una cosa molt important al llibre. Jo fins aquí aniran sortint coses a la conversa i anirem explicant els diferents personatges. Dir-vos que aquesta novel·la, a part de recomanar-vos-la a nosaltres, els editors, biblioteques i jo mateixa, dir-vos que Barack Obama va fer un tuit amb les seves recomanacions. Ell cada any, quan arriba al final, diu quins han estat els seus llibres preferits i de 17 llibres em sembla que hi havia aquesta meitat evanescent de la Brit Bennett, o sigui que us podeu imaginar el nivell del llibre. I Brit, I suppose that was quite a surprise that Barack Obama said that yours was one of his favorite books of 2020.
Yeah, it definitely was a surprise. I don't think I knew that the list was coming out that day at all. And if I had known that, I still would not have expected that my book would be on it. So that was, I think, probably the most surreal moment out of what has been a really surreal experience overall.
Did you see it yourself or someone told you?
Well, I actually was in the middle of something and my best friend called me and it was like the middle of the morning. I was like, why is he calling me? He's supposed to be at work right now. And then I kind of ignored his call and then my agent started calling me and I realized something was happening. So I saw it and I was happy to see it myself, but also to show it to my parents because they were so thrilled.
Mm-hmm. I think the book is dedicated to your family.
Mm-hmm. It is, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Brit, I wanted to ask you first, what's the origin of the book? Because when I was reading it, I was thinking, is it the place where they live? Is it the twins? Is it the family? What's the beginning?
Yeah, I think the beginning for me was really the place, was the town. And the town kind of came out of a conversation I had with my mother, who is originally from Louisiana, and told me about a town she remembered hearing about when she was a girl that her mother told her about. And the idea of this town where everyone who lived there was obsessed with skin color and obsessed with lightness. And that was kind of the launching point. I had never really imagined a place like that. And I wanted to think about what it would be like to leave that place or to return to it. And that's kind of where I eventually landed on the twins.
Mm-hmm. So then after that, then came Desiree and Stella?
Yes, after that, I started thinking about identical twins who came from that place and had very different kind of responses to it. One who decides to live as Black and one who decides to live as white.
Mm-hmm. And why twins? I mean, when you read the book, you understand why. But how did you? Yeah, sorry. How did you come with that idea? What did you want to explain?
Yeah, I think a lot of it to me, I think there's a way that twins are kind of a very natural way to think about identity and to think about, genetics versus the way that you're raised, the kind of eternal nature versus nurture debate that we often are talking about as far as identity. So the idea of that there was kind of a natural way of thinking about these twins who are genetically identical but decide to live completely different lives. There was something about that was interesting, just from a personality standpoint, but also from a racial standpoint, of the idea of these two sisters who can choose to live in these completely different racial worlds and have very different life experiences because of that.
Mm-hmm. You just said that they can choose, and I think the book is also about choices we make in life.
I think so. I think when it comes to identity, I think in particular, I was so curious of the idea of identities that you can choose, because I'm not the type of person who has ever occupied spaces that were ambiguous. Like, I think the way that I identify is the way that people assume I identify by looking at me. So for me, identity has never quite been a matter of choice, but I'm always fascinated with the idea of types of identities where you can choose, or you can choose to be one way in one place and then a different way in a different place. What is it like to kind of move between and among worlds in that way? And what are the costs of those choices?
Mm-hmm. So in what grade identity depends on us?
Yeah, I think that's a big question.
Yeah, sorry about that. We have time though.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's, to me, it was so complex because there's a degree to which, I guess to me, I guess that was one of the questions I was interested in. How much of my identity is what I choose for myself or how I choose to identify? How much of it is what other people see in me? And whether those are people who don't know me or people who know me, how much of it, or how much of my identity is who I want to be, even if that's not who I currently am. Is that who I am? All of those questions to me were really fascinating and complicated to try to untangle a bit, because I think all these characters, they all are occupying all of those spaces. They have versions of themselves that they feel, that they see themselves as. There's versions that their family sees them. There's versions where strangers see them a different way. And I think that's kind of true for a lot of us as we move through the world.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you talk about that racial passing, which I think is something quite common in American literature. Here, we don't know the subject that much. But when you decided to write about that, did you have in mind all the other things that had been written about that previous literature on the subject?
Yeah, I did. I knew that I was writing into this kind of long history of within American literature of racial passing. The first text that I really saw when I was a kid was the movie Imitation of Life, which was a movie I watched with my mom. And that was the first time I ever knew what passing was. I didn't quite understand how it was possible, or really why anybody would want to do it. But that was like a text that I kind of entered. And I think that to me is one of the most, as I've talked to American readers about this book, that's the movie that comes up all the time. Or books like Nella Larsen's Passing, and more contemporary works as well. So I do think that there is this kind of long through line and intrigue when it comes to passing in American literature. I think, in part because there is something so deeply tied up in the kind of American belief in the individual. It's a story, passing is a story about the individual breaking away from the community and deciding to live in a different way. And there's something about that I think really speaks to the mythologies that Americans like to believe about ourselves. And I think beyond that, obviously, like, passing is a really pressing story in a world that has strict racial hierarchies, and that's obviously always been true of America. So to me, it's kind of a marriage between those two realities of both American life, but also American national belief, that makes the passing story such an enduring literary tradition.
Mm-hmm. How would you explain? Because I just asked you the question, and now I know about the word passing, and I totally understood it. But do you think you could explain it for us? Because we really don't have a word that we use as you use it.
Yeah. I mean, I would just explain it as passing as deciding to live as, I mean, in the sort of way that we're using it in this context, when it comes to race, I would say passing is deciding to live as a different race. than the one that you grew up in, perhaps. I'm like fumbling over the words because I think I used to say, I think before publishing this book, if you would have asked me, I would have been like, yeah, passing is pretending to be a different race than what you are. But I think that that language even assumes a lot of things. Like it assumes that there is pretend race and real race, when in fact all race is sort of pretend, you know. So I don't try to use the language of pretense or lying or anything like that anymore. I try to say live as white or live as Black. But even that, like, what does that mean? I mean, all of the language around it is so flimsy. But I think the simplest way I would say is someone who is born and raised as one race deciding to live as a different race.
Mm-hmm. I suppose language has changed quite a lot, and this is something you have dealt with when writing the book, as when other passing stories had been written, I don't know, like 30 or 40 years ago, and especially you are a very young writer talking about that.
I think so. I mean, I think that the sort of my inarticulate attempts of defining it, I think, is an example of the change in language. But I think, you know, for me, what I've mostly noticed of a lot of these older passing stories is that sometimes they had this tendency to really essentialize race and, you know, there's this idea that there's something innate about race in a way that I think I'm certainly uncomfortable asserting that. And I think younger people would be uncomfortable asserting that there's something essential to Blackness or essential to whiteness. Because, you know, so much of the sort of tension and interest in passing stories, and I think in my book as well, is the fact that those categories are fluid. They're unstable. There's not something fixed about them. But I think that in some older passing stories, and I think that's true of the language used, there was a feeling that there was something fixed and people were just kind of putting on costumes to move from one world to another. And, you know, for this book, I'm like, maybe there are costumes, but those are not sort of separated worlds. You know, this idea of what it means to be white or Black. There's a sort of process of becoming Black and a process of becoming white. There's nothing inevitable about it, I suppose, is what I've kind of arrived at.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about fluid categories, and in your book, one of the things that I found more interesting were the thing that we usually say Black and white, but here it's like we had another category, which are the people from Mallard, from this village where they are Black people, but their skin is so light. And for me, and because of their behavior also, I thought it was like as if there were a third category.
I think so. I mean, I think that to me was what was so interesting about the idea of this town, because I think particularly in the South at the time period in which the book begins, which is during, you know, the era of segregation, that is a system of binaries. You know, there's a colored drinking fountain, there's a white drinking fountain. There's no space for in between. And that was kind of how that system of race was established in that time, throughout America in general, but particularly in the South, when it was still legal to sort of categorize people in those ways. But the idea of the town of Mallard resisting those categories, you know, it's a town that lives outside of the white world, but also outside of the larger Black world. And what does it mean to be in that kind of in-between space? There's a way that it can be possibly liberating, but also a way that it can be, I think, isolating and lonely. And I think that that's an experience that the twins have at one point or another.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that town your mother told you about?
I did not, and I think that was kind of what really intrigued me. I think if I had found it, I may have been less interested in writing the book, but the idea that I couldn't find it made it feel larger than life and almost like something out of a myth, and that was really what drew me in.
Mm-hmm. I would like to talk a little bit about Stella. I'm gonna say that Stella is one of the twins. She's the one who decides to live as a white person. She had tried passing before, but this time what she does it seems really unbelievable. And I think as a reader, you suffer all the time because you think that someone is gonna realize that in fact she's Black, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I loved the idea of watching the sort of gradations of Stella's attempts to pass. How in the beginning it's something that's almost daring. It's sort of a thrilling thing to do because she's kind of rebelling in this way. And you know, it's just fun to see if you can rebel and if you can get away with it, and that's it. But then over time, you know, that becomes more not just this kind of momentary rebellion. It becomes something that she ends up sinking deeper and deeper into until that becomes her entire life. So I loved exploring that, and also creating that tension that you described, that you experience as the reader, of that constant feeling that she's going to be caught. To me, that was one of the most fascinating things of thinking about the experience of passing, of what it must be like to live in this world, and feel both outside of that world, and also at the same time feel like you have to desperately cling to it, because if Stella loses her life that she's built as a white woman, what does she really have left? You know, she really has nothing at that point, because she's left behind her family and her past and her community. So that constant fear that she has, the fact that she, you know, ostensibly passes because she wants to have safety and peace and freedom, but she ends up feeling so completely trapped the entire time. There's something really ironic about that to me.
Mm-hmm. And when she needs to keep the secret, of course, she has to say things that happen to be racist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, to me, the really interesting thing about Stella is that she has to perform whiteness convincingly in order to, you know, cover up the fact that she is passing. But at the same time, she's always performing whiteness in a way that is so over the top that it often makes other white people uncomfortable. You know, it's so you know, she is presumably so anti-Black that even her husband is kind of like, okay, it's, you know, tone it down. But to me, that was really fascinating to kind of imagine her psychology, because I was thinking to myself, you know, this is a woman who grew up as a Black child in the South. Her only experience with white people is racism. So if she is then performing whiteness, why would she perform anything other than that? That's all she knows. You know, she doesn't know the way that white people are around each other, because she's never been experiencing that. She's only known the way that white people are around her. So that's what she's going to perform. And to me, a lot of sort of watching Stella was trying to figure out how she tries to perform whiteness in a way that's convincing, but because she performs it in the way that she experienced it, it's so off-putting to everyone around her, and it ends up often creating new problems for herself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not so sure she really is free, but this is like a reader comment. Yeah, sorry. When the story takes place from 1968 to 1988, and we don't only share the lives of Desiree and Stella, who are the twin sisters, and their mother, because at the beginning they live with Adele, with their mother, but also they have they both get married. One is luckier than the other one. And they have children. They have a girl. Each of them has a daughter. Was it important that you were talking about not only one but 2 and 3 generations?
You know, I originally did not plan to do that. I originally thought the book would just be about the twins. And as time went by and I kept writing, I became really interested in Jude, first of all, Desiree's daughter, who is the child that you meet in the opening page of the book. She has a dark-skinned daughter, and they arrived back at the town. And I became really interested in the experience of Jude growing up in this horrible place.
Yeah,
and then by extension, yeah, it's horrible. And then by extension, I became really interested in what Stella's daughter's life would be like, because she's growing up under completely different circumstances. So I didn't think it was going to be multi-generational as I started writing it, but over time I did become really fascinated in thinking about the relationships between those mothers and their daughters and what the next generation of that family would just look like.
Yeah, because their stories, I mean, it could not happen because we're talking about the States, but their stories in the book, they are intertwined. And I thought, I don't know, what is she trying to tell us? And I thought maybe she's trying to tell us that there are things that you can't escape from.
I mean, I think to some extent, you know, I think thinking of what is passed down from mother to daughter or from parent to child is always just interesting for me, I think, as from a story point of view, because I think about my relationships with my parents. You know, I consider myself to be pretty close to my parents, but there's so much of their lives that I don't know and may never find out. They just may never tell me. And at the same time, so much of the way that I've grown up or the things that I believe about the world have been shaped by them. And I still don't have all of the information I need to understand them completely. You know, there's something about some dynamic about that of being somebody's child that I find to be really confounding. So the idea of these two daughters, Jude has a pretty good relationship with her mother. Kennedy does not.
No.
And so, you know, but they both are kind of inheriting what their mothers have experienced and what their mothers have chosen. And Kennedy does not even have any way of understanding her mother's past or her life. And yet she's kind of inheriting and living in the wake of everything that her mother has gone through. So there was something about that, I think, that felt really interesting to explore when it came to the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was like the weight of the past, that it's not only on Desiree's and Stella's shoulders, but also in Jude's and Kennedy's, and it's so heavy.
Yes, I think so. I think so, the weight of history in a way.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you, why did you choose to put the story between 1968 and 1988?
Yeah, I mean, I think originally I remember when I was first thinking about the book, and I remember telling somebody that I was writing this book and it was about passing, and I told her when it was set. And she told me, like, no, your book is set too late in time. You know, most stories about passing are set in the 30s, 40s, maybe slightly earlier. And we don't really have a lot of stories about passing set during that time period. But that was, I think, one of the reasons why I was really drawn to it, because that period is kind of the civil rights era and post-civil rights era in American history. And it's such a period of tumultuous change. The idea that, and that's not to say, obviously, that, you know, everything and all of the race problems were magically fixed during those years. But to look at somebody like Stella, who grows up going to, you know, living in a segregated town, going to a segregated school as a child, and then 10 years later, she could be living in a neighborhood that is integrated. And then 10 years after that, you know, whatever could be happening. That's something that could happen in that time period in a way that it's hard to find another period of time that when it comes to something like that, where you see that huge leap of what is possible when it comes to race and gender, sexuality, all these other categories of being. Where you had these leaps of what was possible and what paths were available to these characters. So to me, there was something about that was really fun. The idea that this was a time period where so much was changing, and you have all of these characters themselves who are undergoing lots of change, and they're kind of changing in these dramatic ways alongside the country itself.
Mm-hmm. I think your book was published a week after the assassination of George Floyd. So
yeah, it was published right around there. So yeah, I mean, it was, you know, strange to it was strange. Everything about publishing a book last year was strange. So yeah. I think
you're right.
You know, there was no way of knowing any of that context. I think the context I was prepared for was, oh, it's an election year. My first book came out during an election year too. So I just thought, okay, it's going to be that again. And then, of course, the pandemic hits, and then we have this sort of rise of protests over last summer. And that became instead the immediate context surrounding the book.
Mm-hmm. But when you read your book and it stops at 1988, but when you see the news in 2021, you think about what happened in those 40 years, 30 years. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry about that. You just said that, but I thought that there were a lot of journeys in your book. Like the characters, they are moving a lot. And I thought that was important.
Yeah, I think in general, I'm kind of interested in that, of characters undergoing physical movement and emotional movement in the same way. Again, when I first started thinking about this book, I thought it would all take place in Mallard. I thought we would just be in that town forever. But then I became really interested in where Stella was going to end up. Like, how can she end up in a place that's going to be very different than where she's from? And then again, with their daughters, of where they end up going in the country. So everybody's kind of crisscrossing the country in these strange ways. But I think it was also, for me, it was a really interesting way to think about the role of race and the way that it is dependent on region. But that's not to say that, you know, I think as a person who grew up in California, I think a lot of Californians often believe that, you know, racism happens in the South and not anywhere else. Like, that's where the racists live. And of course, the history of the American South has a very distinct history about race. But at the same time, racism is everywhere. And the idea that, you know, when Stella's a child, she, you know, is witnessing these acts of violence by mobs. She's not seeing mobs in her, you know, her new life in California, but there's still the same type of mentality. You know, there's still a way that people are banding together in order to punish and to exclude and to sort of enact white supremacist violence. It just may not be a mob. It may be, you know, it may be hiring a lawyer. It may be something that's legal, but it still acts in the same way. And that, to me, was what became also interesting, was thinking of, when these characters end up in different parts of the country, what are the rules of race there? How do they operate, perhaps differently, but still operate under the sort of guiding principle of white supremacy?
Mm-hmm. Your book talks about race, but it also talks a lot about gender identity and sexual identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, historically, I think books about passing are often about multiple forms of passing. So to me, it felt pretty natural to also kind of dive into these questions of gender and think about these characters that are also having journeys through gender in a way that's different than race, but kind of happening alongside race.
Mm-hmm. When, after finishing the book, I thought that the title was great. I don't know if you decided it, but I think like everything that happens is on the title.
Yeah, I did not pick the title myself. I am terrible at coming up with titles. But my agent and my editor, we all kind of put our heads together and brainstormed. And we ended up feeling like the title really spoke to the thematics of the book in a lot of different ways, of as far as what's happening with Stella and Desiree and with the family itself, but also these characters all undergoing their individual transformations and journeys.
Mm-hmm. You talk a lot about family and about relationships, especially between women.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm just interested in, to be honest. I grew up in a family of mostly women. It was just my dad and my mom and my two sisters and myself. So I grew up in a heavily female household. And I think just throughout my life, the most important and meaningful relationships to me have been with my female friends. So I'm always interested in those really complex relationships between and among women, how they can be so emotionally intimate, but also so fraught and complicated and often hard. And I think that was driving me when I was thinking about my first novel, of the friendship between these two friends, and the complexity of that. And then for this, thinking about the relationship between sisters and cousins and mothers and daughters, these pairs of and groupings of women. So I think to me, it's that kind of idea that they can be the closest relationships you have and the most valuable relationships you have, but it can also be really emotionally fraught.
Mm-hmm. I thought that there was a lot of love in your book, and I especially liked the relationship between Jude and Reese, which is so natural.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's the relationship that readers have connected to more than anything. I've been really overwhelmed by the reaction to that relationship in particular. But yeah, I mean, I think, my first book had relationships that were pretty awful, to be honest. In my first book, they were pretty toxic relationships between the couples. And in this book, I wanted to challenge myself to write a relationship that was healthy and a relationship that was based on love and respect and trust. And it's kind of sad, I think, that there aren't that many relationships like that in fiction or on TV or anything.
You're right.
Like,
yeah.
It's rare to watch a relationship between people who like each other. So, I wanted to challenge myself to write a relationship that was complicated, but also that was based on love and trust, and people who both have undergone a lot of pain as children, but still find a way to grow from it and learn to love each other and trust each other. So I wanted there to be, I know that there's a lot of moments of brutality or violence in this book, but I also wanted there to be joy and tenderness.
Yeah, because we have Sam, who abuses his Desiree's husband, and in fact she leaves because he's abusing her, and that's why she takes her daughter and she leaves.
Exactly. Yeah. So I knew that there were going to be moments like that of violence and brutality, and to see, I think, particularly Desiree, she tries to sort of come out of that relationship and find a way to love and trust again. That was something else, I think, of a lot of these characters. How do you come out from pain and find a way to kind of open yourself up and make yourself vulnerable again and let somebody else in?
Mm-hmm. Was it difficult for you to write this novel? Because at the end of the book, you say thank you to those who told you that, I don't know how you said it in English, because I read the translation, but to those who said that it wasn't impossible to write a second novel.
I mean, I think that the translation captures how frustrated I was.
Yeah, you have very nice translators, I have to say, in Catalan and Spanish. Yeah,
that sounds perfectly accurate. Yeah, I mean, I think second novels are really hard, and I imagine I'll say the same thing about third novels too. But for me, this was a really different book than my first book. It was a bigger book. It was captured so much more time, so many more characters. It was just a challenging book, just structurally, to write and how to put together all those pieces. And then beyond that, I was coming off of a first book that was received pretty well. So I didn't want to disappoint people who really liked my first book. I didn't want to, to have the sophomore slump, as they call it. I didn't want that either. So I knew that I had a lot of pressure on myself to write a great book. And I knew also that the book I was trying to write was a challenging book. So it was difficult, but I was grateful for all, my family, friends, people who listened to me complain about this book for years as I was trying to figure it out. I was very grateful for all the help I had around me to finally get it together.
Yeah, and it turned out quite well.
Thank you.
I think there's going to be a TV series.
Yeah, we sold the rights to HBO.
HBO, wow.
Yeah, so, I'm not writing it. I'm serving as an executive producer. So I'm able to weigh in creatively, but I'm not responsible for adapting it. But we have really great writers on board, and I'm excited to see how we bring this to television screen.
Mm-hmm. We'll wait for it too. Thank you so much, Brit, for being with us today. It was really my pleasure. And I hope we will be able to read the mothers also, now that we've discovered you.
Yes.
We won't let you go. So maybe we will be talking soon about the mothers, but let's for now enjoy the Vanishing Half. Congratulations on your book and on all the success it's having. And come visit us when it's possible. When it's possible.
I can't wait. Yes, I can't wait to visit once I can. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.